He was declared dead at 9:17 that morning, but the dog never stopped listening. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere warm, I hope, because this story, it carries a kind of chill that doesn't come from the weather. And if you believe that some bonds run deeper than breath itself, stay with me. The sky above the small coastal cemetery in New South Wales hung low and pale, like it had forgotten how to be blue. A quiet wind drifted in from the Pacific, carrying the faint scent of salt and eucalyptus, brushing softly over rows of white markers that stood like silent witnesses. It wasn't a large gathering, just a handful of uniforms, a few family members, and the kind of stillness that settles when words feel too heavy to speak. At the center of it all rested a polished timber coffin, draped in a neatly folded flag, edges sharp, colors steady against the gray of the day. Beside it stood a man who had once been everything the word Marine could hold: strength, discipline, quiet resolve. Now, he was a name spoken in past tense. Ethan Walker, 32, born in Perth, served with honor, declared gone. But not everyone agreed with that last part. A few meters away, restrained by a simple lead held too tightly by trembling hands, stood Rex. A German shepherd, 6 years old, coat the color of sunburnt earth and shadow, muscles held in a tension that didn't belong in a place like this. His ears were forward, not lowered. His stance wasn't grief. It was alert, watching, listening, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm no one else can feel. He hadn't made a sound when they arrived. Not in the car. Not when the coffin was carried past him. Not even when the first shovel of dirt had been placed nearby, waiting. But something had shifted the moment the wind changed. It was subtle, almost nothing, just a flicker through the trees. A shift in scent too faint for human senses. But Rex felt it. His nose lifted slightly, drawing in the air as if searching for a memory that refused to stay buried. The handler beside him whispered softly, voice cracking under the weight of the day, but Rex didn't respond. His amber eyes were locked, unblinking, on the coffin. Not with confusion, not with fear, but with certainty. A certainty that didn't belong in a funeral. Time stretched. The chaplain spoke, his voice low and steady, words about service, sacrifice, and peace. They floated through the air like distant echoes, barely touching the ground. A gull cried somewhere overhead, sharp and lonely, then vanished into the silence. Boots shifted against gravel. A quiet cough. The world kept moving in small, respectful motions. But Rex remained still. Then, without warning, his body stiffened. Not dramatically, just enough. A ripple through muscle and bone. His head tilted a fraction, as if catching a sound that didn't belong to the living. And then, he stepped forward. The lead snapped tight. The handler pulled back, surprised, whispering his name again, firmer this time. But Rex didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the pressure. His focus narrowed, sharpened, like a compass finding true north after being lost. One step became two. Slow, deliberate, every movement measured, as though he was walking toward something only he could sense. A low sound built in his chest, not quite a growl, not yet a bark. Something deeper, something older, the kind of sound that doesn't ask for attention. It demands it. A few heads turned. A Marine near the front frowned slightly, eyes shifting between the dog and the coffin. No one spoke. No one quite understood why the air had suddenly changed. But they felt it. That quiet pressure. That subtle wrongness. Rex reached the edge of where the coffin rested. The lead strained behind him, but it no longer mattered. His nose hovered just above the polished surface, not touching. Just there, suspended in a moment that didn't belong to logic. And then he froze. Completely. The sound in his chest vanished. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Even the ocean, not far beyond the cliffs, felt distant. Rex's ears twitched once, twice, and for a single, fragile second, he listened, not to the world around him, but to something beneath it, something hidden, something still there. The silence did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like frost giving way under the first hint of morning. Sun, and everyone felt it before anyone understood it. A shift so subtle it might have been dismissed if not for the dog standing motionless at the coffin, his body locked in a stillness that was not natural, not for a living creature, not for something that breathes and blinks and exists in the ordinary rhythm of the world. But Rex was no longer part of that rhythm, not in that moment. he had stepped outside it, into something quieter, deeper, where instinct speaks louder than reason and time. Itself seems to hesitate, his nose hovering inches above the polished timber, drawing in the faintest trace of air, and then holding it, as if he was afraid that even the smallest exhale might erase what he had found. Behind him, the handler shifted his weight, unsure whether to pull him back or let him be. The lead taut, but no longer controlling, just connected, like a thread between two different realities, one grounded in ceremony and protocol, the other drifting towards something no one had prepared for. A woman near the front pressed her hand to her mouth, not out of shock, not yet, but because something in her chest had tightened without explanation. The chaplain's voice faltered for the first time, words trailing off into the wind as if even they had lost their place. And still Rex did not move. His ears flicked again, sharper this time, responding to something that existed beneath the reach of human hearing, a rhythm perhaps, or the echo of one, faint, fragile, buried under layers of silence and assumption, the kind of sound that does not travel far but does not need to, because it is meant for one listener only. His chest rose once, slow and deliberate, and then the sound came, not loud, not aggressive, but steady, a low bark that cut through the air like a line drawn across still water. It was not a warning, it was not confusion, it was certainty, the kind that does not ask permission to be believed. A few heads turned fully now, eyes narrowing, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told. A Marine standing near the coffin stepped closer, boots crunching softly on gravel, his gaze fixed on Rex with the quiet respect of someone who had seen enough to know when something did not fit. He never does that, he said, barely above a whisper, not to anyone in particular, just to the space itself, as if the truth might settle there and make sense of things. Rex barked again, slightly louder, his body leaning forward now, the restraint at his collar beginning to tremble under the pressure. The handler tried once more, a gentle pull, a quiet command, but it fell away like a word spoken into the ocean, unheard, unnecessary. Rex's focus had narrowed completely, everything else fading into the background. The wind, the voices, the presence of others, none of it mattered. There was only the coffin, and whatever lay within it, or perhaps whatever refused to leave it. The Marine beside the coffin glanced down at the polished surface, then back at the dog, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, quick, almost hidden, but real, because doubt does not need time to grow. It only needs a crack, and Rex had already made one. Another bark, sharper now, followed by a sudden stillness. He lowered his head slightly, pressing closer without touching, his ears angled forward with precision, as if aligning himself with something invisible, listening not just with his ears, but with his entire being. And then it happened again, that pause, that impossible suspension of everything, where even the ocean seemed to retreat, holding its breath along with the rest of the world. Rex did not bark this time. He did not move. He simply listened. And in that listening, there was something else, something that shifted the weight of the moment from strange to undeniable. The Marine's hand hovered over the coffin, not touching, just there, as if drawn by the same pull. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing further, searching for reason, for logic, for anything that could anchor what he was feeling. But there was none, because some things do not arrive with explanation, they arrive with presence. And presence is harder to ignore. The handler's grip loosened without him realizing, the lead slackening just enough to give Rex the space he needed, not because he chose to, but because something in him understood that stopping the dog now would be like interrupting a sentence that had not yet finished being spoken. The air thickened, not with tension, but with anticipation, quiet and heavy, like the moment before rain begins. And Rex, steady, unwavering, placed his paw gently against the side of the coffin, not scratching, not forcing, just resting there, a point of contact between two worlds. His head tilted once more, and for a fraction of a second, his entire body softened, not in relief, not in grief, but in recognition, as if whatever he had been searching for had finally answered back, not with words, not with movement, but with something far more fragile, something that could easily be missed if you were not listening the way he was. And that was the moment everything changed, not because anyone had seen anything, but because the dog had. And in that quiet, unwavering certainty, the truth began to rise, slow and unstoppable, like something long buried remembering how to breathe. The moment did not explode into chaos. It unfolded quietly, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for someone brave enough to notice it. And Rex, still with his paw resting against the coffin, did not move, because he did not need to. He had already found what the others had not even thought to look for. The Marine standing closest swallowed slowly, his hand now resting flat against the polished timber, feeling nothing at first, just the cool surface, smooth and still, exactly as it should have been, exactly as they had been told. But something in his chest refused to settle. That same quiet resistance that had begun with the dog, spreading now, subtle but undeniable. He leaned in slightly, not enough for anyone to question, just enough to close the distance between certainty and doubt. And for a second, just a single, fragile second, he thought he felt it. Not movement, not a sound, but a suggestion of something, like a memory brushing past the edge of awareness, too soft to hold, too real to dismiss. He pulled his hand back instinctively, eyes flicking toward the handler, then to the others, searching for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything that could anchor him again. But no one spoke, because no one else had felt it. Not yet. Rex shifted then, not away, but closer, his body pressing gently against the side of the coffin, his head lowering until his ear hovered just above the wood. The position deliberate, precise, the way he had been trained, the way he had always listened for what others could not detect. And then he stilled again, completely, his breathing slowing, his entire focus narrowing into that single point of contact. And this time, when the Marine placed his hand back on the coffin, he did not pull away. He waited, holding his breath without realizing, letting the silence stretch just long enough for something to break through it. And there it was, faint, almost imagined, but not imagined enough to ignore, a soft, irregular rhythm, so slight it could have been mistaken for the echo of his own pulse. But it was not his. It was slower, weaker, but there, beneath layers of assumption and procedure, something persisted, something that had not ended when they said it. Had. His eyes widened, not in panic, but in disbelief that had nowhere to go. Did you feel that? He murmured, barely audible, and the question hung in the air like a spark, waiting for something to catch. The handler stepped closer now, uncertainty written across his face. Feel what? He asked, but his voice lacked conviction, because even as he spoke, he saw it in Rex, saw the unwavering certainty that could not be trained, could not be commanded, only trusted. The Marine did not answer immediately, because answers require confidence, and confidence requires proof, and all he had was a feeling, a possibility, a line that had been crossed without permission. He pressed his hand again, firmer this time, and waited, seconds stretching longer than they should, until once again, there it was, faint but undeniable, a rhythm that did not belong in a coffin. His breath caught, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. He looked up sharply, eyes locking with the handler's. And in that glance, something passed between them. Not words, not logic, but recognition. The kind that comes when two people realize they are standing at the edge of something that cannot be undone. Rex lifted his head then, just slightly, his eyes meeting the Marine's, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the dog was not asking for permission, but offering confirmation, as if to say, "You hear it now. Do not you?" The Marine straightened, his voice stronger now, carrying just enough to reach the others without breaking the fragile tension that held the moment together. "Wait," he said, and the single word cut through the ceremony like a shift in tide. Heads turned fully now, confusion replacing quiet acceptance. The chaplain paused, the wind stirred again, as if the world itself had decided it could not remain still any longer. "Something is not right," the Marine added, and though he could not explain it, though he did not yet understand it, the certainty in his tone was enough to make even doubt hesitate. The handler released the lead completely now, not out of decision, but because there was no longer a reason to hold it. Rex did not move away. He stayed exactly where he was, his body aligned with the coffin, his presence steady, grounding, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along, not the moment of loss, but the moment of truth. And in the quiet that followed, something shifted in everyone present, a a subtle unraveling of what they had accepted, replaced now by something far more uncertain, but also far more real. And as the Marine's hand remained pressed against the wood, feeling that faint, persistent rhythm beneath, the impossible began to take shape, not as a miracle, not yet, but as a question that refused to be buried. And Rex, unwavering, stood as the only one who had known the answer from the very beginning. No one moved at first, because movement would mean choosing a side between what they had been told and what they were beginning to feel. And that was not a simple step, not in a place like this, not in a moment that had already been sealed with quiet acceptance. The Marine kept his hand pressed against the coffin, his palm flat, fingers spread as if trying to gather more than just sensation, trying to hold on to something that might slip away if he let it go. And beneath that still surface, that faint, uneven rhythm returned again, soft, but persistent, like a signal too weak for machines but strong enough for something living to recognize. His breath steadied, not because he was calm, but because he needed to be, because panic would blur what he was trying to confirm, and certainty demanded clarity. He glanced down once more, then back at the others, and this time he did not hesitate. "We need to open it," he said, his voice low but firm, not loud, not commanding, but grounded in something deeper than authority. It carried the weight of someone who had crossed the line from doubt into belief, the kind of belief that does not shout. It simply stands and refuses to step back. A ripple moved through the small gathering, subtle but unmistakable, eyes shifting, shoulders tightening. The chaplain lowered his hand slowly, the words he had been holding dissolving into the air. A woman near the front shook her head slightly, not in denial, but in confusion, as if the world had tilted just enough to unsettle her balance. The handler stepped forward now, his gaze fixed on Rex, who remained exactly where he was, steady, unwavering, his presence no longer strange but necessary, like a piece of truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen. "Are you sure?" the handler asked quietly, not challenging, just needing something to hold on to. The Marine did not look away from the coffin. "No," he answered honestly, and then, after a breath, "But he is." His eyes flicked briefly toward Rex, and in that glance there was something close to trust, not blind, not reckless, but earned, built over years of watching what the dog could do, what he could sense, what he could find when everything else failed. Another Marine stepped closer, his boots stopping just short of the edge, his expression tight, caught between protocol and instinct. "We cannot just," he began, but the words faded before they could take shape, because even he could feel it now, not the rhythm, not yet, but the shift, the quiet insistence that something here did not align with what they had accepted. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the trees, carrying with it that same faint scent that had first reached Rex, subtle, almost nothing, but enough to stir something deeper than thought. The handler knelt beside the coffin, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently against the wood, mirroring what the Marine had done, his fingers trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he might find. He closed his eyes briefly, not in prayer, but in focus, letting the noise of the moment fall away. And then he felt it, not clearly, not fully, but enough, a suggestion of life where there should have been none. His eyes opened quickly, meeting the Marine's, and this time there was no question, only confirmation, silent but absolute. Rex shifted his weight then, just a fraction, his tail still, his posture steady, as if acknowledging that the moment had arrived, that the line had been crossed, and there was no returning to what had been assumed before. The Marine reached for the edge of the coffin, his hand pausing just above it, not from hesitation, but from respect, because whatever lay inside was not just a possibility. It was a life, fragile, hidden, waiting. "On three," he said quietly, and the others moved closer, not because they had decided, but because they could no longer stand apart. 1, the word barely audible. 2, the world seemed to narrow, every sound fading, every movement slowing. 3, the lid shifted, not violently, not abruptly, but with a careful, deliberate motion, the kind used when handling something that matters. The hinges gave a soft, almost reluctant sound, and as the gap opened, the air changed, not dramatically, not with a rush, but with a subtle difference that only those closest could feel. like stepping from shadow into light. Rex leaned forward, his nose dipping slightly, his ears forward, his entire being focused on that opening. And then, for a moment, nothing happened, just a stillness that stretched long enough to test every doubt, every fear, every fragile hope that had led them here. The Marine held his breath. The handler did the same. And then it came, not a movement, not yet, but a breath, shallow, uneven, but unmistakably real, a sound so soft it could have been lost in the wind if not for the silence that had fallen around it. The Marine's eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition, because there are some things you do not mistake once you have felt them, once you have waited for them. "He is breathing," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but it carried, because truth does not need volume to be heard. Rex let out a low sound then, not a bark, not a growl, but something softer, something closer to relief, his body finally easing just slightly, the tension that had held him rigid beginning to release. Not completely, not yet, but enough to show that the certainty he had carried was no longer a burden. It had become reality, and in that quiet moment, as the man inside the coffin drew another fragile breath, the world shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because what had been declared finished was not finished at all, and the only one who had known it from the very beginning stood there, steady and silent, as if he had simply been waiting for the rest of them to catch up. The second breath did not come quickly. It arrived slowly, unevenly, like something remembering how to exist after being forgotten, and in that fragile pause between each inhale, the entire world seemed to lean closer, as if even the wind understood that this was no longer a moment for distance. The Marine's hands remained steady on the edge of the coffin, though his chest tightened with every second that passed, watching, waiting, counting without meaning to, one, then another, and then the faint rise again, shallow but undeniable. Ethan Walker was still there, not gone, not beyond reach, just quiet, suspended in a place no one had expected to find him. The handler exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his eyes fixed on the man inside, searching for more, for movement, for anything that would anchor this moment in something real and lasting. Rex moved then, not with urgency, but with purpose, his front paws stepping closer until his body aligned fully. With the open coffin, his head lowering gently, carefully, as if approaching something sacred, his nose hovering just above Ethan's chest, drawing in the faintest trace of scent, and then settling, his ears still. Forward, his entire posture softened now, no longer searching, no longer questioning, just present, as if he had finally arrived where he had been trying to lead them all along. The Marine glanced toward the others, his voice steadier now, grounded in what they could all see. "We need help. Now," he said, and though it was not loud, it carried a new kind of urgency, not panic, but clarity, the kind that comes when uncertainty gives way to action. One of the younger Marines stepped back quickly, reaching for his radio, his hands moving with practiced precision, but his eyes kept returning to the scene before him, as if afraid it might disappear if he looked away for too long. The chaplain stood still, his hands lowered, his expression no longer focused on ceremony, but on something far more immediate, something far more human. The woman near the front took a slow step forward, her hand still near her mouth, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with something closer to disbelief that had begun to soften into fragile hope. Rex let out a quiet sound then, barely audible, a low, steady exhale that seemed to carry more than just breath, as if it held recognition, reassurance, something wordless but complete. Ethan's chest rose again, slightly deeper this time, the rhythm still uneven, but stronger, like a signal finding its way back through interference. The Marine reached down carefully, his hand moving toward Ethan's shoulder, not to shake, not to disturb, just to confirm what his eyes and ears were already telling him. The warmth was there, faint but real, not imagined, not mistaken. His jaw tightened briefly, not from tension, but from the weight of what they had almost lost without knowing. The handler shifted closer, his gaze moving between Ethan and Rex, understanding now settling into place, slow but certain. He knew. He said quietly, not as a statement to anyone else, but as an acknowledgement of what had just unfolded. Rex did not respond, not in the way humans might expect. He simply remained there, steady, his presence unwavering, his eyes half softened as they rested on Ethan, as if guarding not just the man, but the fragile return of something that had almost slipped away unnoticed. The radio crackled softly in the background, voices responding, footsteps beginning to move, the world returning to motion around them. But the center of it all remained still, grounded in that single, quiet truth. Ethan Walker was alive, not because of chance, not because of timing, but because something had refused to let him be forgotten, something that did not rely on reports or procedures, something that listened when others had stopped. The Marine straightened slightly, his gaze sweeping the small group, seeing in their faces the same shift he felt within himself, the quiet understanding that they had crossed from farewell into something entirely different, something that demanded presence, attention, care, and above all, belief. Rex lifted his head just slightly, his ears relaxing for the first time since they had arrived. The tension that had held him rigid now easing into something calmer, something steadier, as if the weight he had carried had finally been set down. He did not bark again. He did not need to. His work was done, not in the way it had begun, but in the way it had ended, with quiet certainty becoming visible truth. The Marine looked down once more at Ethan, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, each breath a small defiance of what had already been accepted. And in that moment, there was no need for explanation, no need for logic to catch up, because some things do not wait to be understood. They simply exist, undeniable. Undeniable as the bond that had brought them here, a bond that had listened when the world had gone silent, that had stood firm when everything else had moved on. And as the distant sound of approaching help grew closer, carried faintly over the wind, Rex remained beside the coffin, no longer searching, no longer calling, just watching, just staying, as if he had always known that this was not the end, only a moment waiting to be seen clearly. And now, finally, it was. The siren did not arrive as a sudden interruption. It grew slowly from the distance. A thin thread of sound carried over the coastal wind, weaving its way through the trees and the quiet rows of stone until it reached them. And even then, it did not break the moment. It only joined it, becoming part of the fragile rhythm that had begun to return. The Marine stepped back slightly to make space, his movements careful, deliberate, as if even the ground beneath his boots deserved respect now. Ethan's chest continued its uneven rise and fall, each breath still shallow but steadier than before, like a tide that had turned but had not yet reached the shore. Rex remained close, his head just above Ethan's chest, his eyes half-lidded but alert, not watching for danger, not searching for answers anymore, just present, holding the space in a way no one else could. The handler placed a gentle hand on Rex's shoulder, not to restrain, not to command, just to connect, and for the first time since they had arrived, Rex allowed the touch without resistance, his body no longer tense, his breathing calm, as if the weight he had carried had finally settled into something that no longer needed to be proven. The ambulance came into view beyond the cemetery gates, its white frame cutting softly through the muted colors of the day, not urgent in appearance, but purposeful, steady, the kind of arrival that speaks of quiet competence rather than chaos. Two paramedics stepped out quickly, but without rush, their movements efficient, grounded, guided by the kind of experience that knows when to act fast and when to move carefully. The Marine met them halfway, his words brief, direct, not filled with explanation, just enough to shift their focus to what mattered. And when they reached the coffin, they paused, just for a moment, not because they doubted, but because even they could feel it, that subtle difference in the air, that quiet insistence that something here did not follow the expected path. One of them knelt beside Ethan, his hand moving to check what could not be seen, his expression changing almost instantly, not to surprise, but to confirmation. "He is with us," he said calmly. And those simple words carried more weight than any ceremony could have. The other paramedic prepared what was needed, movements smooth, practiced, the kind that do not draw attention to themselves, but hold everything together. Rex stepped back just slightly, not because he was told to, but because he understood, his role shifting naturally, seamlessly, from discovery to guardianship. He watched closely as they worked, his ears still attentive, his gaze steady, not interfering, not anxious, just present, as if ensuring that the fragile thread they had found would not be lost again. Ethan's breathing deepened incrementally, still uneven but stronger, each inhale a quiet reclaiming of something that had nearly slipped beyond reach. The handler crouched beside Rex, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You did it, mate," he said, not expecting a response, not needing one, because the truth of it did not require acknowledgement. Rex's tail moved once, a slow, deliberate motion, not excitement, not relief, just a quiet release of tension that had held for far too long. The Marine stood a few steps back now, watching, his arms at his sides, his posture straight but softened, the rigid lines of protocol, replaced by something more human, more grounded. His gaze moved from Ethan to Rex and back again, as if trying to understand how the two were connected in a way that did not fit within the boundaries of what he had been taught. The stretcher was brought forward, positioned carefully, every movement measured to protect what had been found, and as they lifted Ethan from the coffin, there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when his hand shifted slightly, not fully, not with intention, but enough to show that something within him was responding, returning. Rex noticed it immediately, his head tilting, his ears lifting just a fraction, and for a second, his body leaned forward again, drawn by that subtle sign of life. But he did not step closer, he did not interrupt, he simply watched, as if acknowledging that the moment had passed from his care into theirs, and that was enough. The paramedics secured Ethan gently, their focus unwavering, their movement steady, the kind that do not waste energy on doubt, because doubt had already been replaced by action. The ambulance doors opened wider, the interior ready, waiting, a space prepared not for endings, but for continuation. The handler stood slowly, his hand still resting lightly on Rex, both of them facing the same direction now, watching as Ethan was carried away from the place that had nearly become his final resting point. The wind shifted again, softer this time, carrying with it a sense of release, not closure, but something close, the kind that comes when a story refuses to end the way it was written. Rex took a single step forward as the stretcher passed, his eyes following, not with urgency, not with fear, but with quiet assurance, as if he already knew that this was not a farewell, not this time. And as the ambulance doors closed and the engine began its low, steady hum, the world around them began to move again, voices returning, footsteps resuming. But at the center of it all, something had changed in a way that could not be undone, because they had all seen it now, not just the breath, not just the movement, but the undeniable truth that had stood before them in silence, carried not by words, not by reports, but by a dog who refused to listen to anything except what was real. And as the ambulance rolled slowly away, Rex remained where he was, no longer searching, no longer calling, just standing in the quiet aftermath, as if to remind anyone who might forget that sometimes the smallest act of listening can change everything. The sound of the ambulance faded slowly down the narrow coastal road, its presence dissolving into the distance until it became nothing more than a memory carried by the wind. And with it went the urgency, the movement, the sense that something fragile needed constant attention, leaving behind a stillness that felt different now, not heavy like before, not filled with quiet mourning, but lighter, uncertain, as if the air itself was trying to adjust to what had just unfolded. The small group remained where they stood, not quite ready to leave, not quite able to return to what they had been doing before, because what they had witnessed did not fit neatly into any ending they understood. The Marine who had first spoken stepped back from the now empty space where the coffin had rested, his eyes lingering there, as if expecting something more to appear, something to explain how close they had come to losing a man who had never truly gone. His hands moved slowly to his sides, fingers curling and uncurling as though trying to release the last trace of tension that still held in his muscles. The handler remained beside Rex, his posture relaxed for the first time that day, shoulders lowered, breath steady, but his gaze remained fixed on the road where the ambulance had disappeared, not out of worry, but out of something deeper, something closer to understanding. Rex stood quietly at his side, his body no longer rigid, no longer poised between action and restraint, but grounded, calm, his ears relaxed, his tail still, The intensity that had defined him only moments before now replaced by a quiet presence that felt almost ordinary. And yet, nothing about it was ordinary, not after what he had done. A light breeze moved through the trees again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of the ocean, mingling with the dry earth beneath their boots. And for a moment, it felt as though the land itself was acknowledging the shift, the subtle turning of something that had nearly been set in stone. The chaplain stepped forward slowly, his expression thoughtful, no longer bound to the words he had prepared, because those words belonged to a different ending, one that no longer applied. He looked at the empty space, then at the small group gathered around it, and finally at Rex, his gaze resting there just a little longer, not with curiosity, but with quiet respect, as if recognizing something beyond training, beyond instinct. Something that did not need to be named to be understood. The woman who had stood near the front lowered her hand at last, her fingers brushing lightly against her chest as she exhaled a breath she had held for too long. Her eyes softened, the disbelief that had once filled them now settling into something gentler, something that did not ask for explanation, only acceptance. One of the younger Marines shifted his weight, glancing at the others as if searching for someone to say something, to mark the moment, to bring it to a close, but no one did, because there was no proper way to close something that had refused to end. The handler reached down and unclipped the lead from Rex's collar, the small metal sound barely audible, but significant in its own quiet way, a release, not just of restraint, but of the role Rex had carried until now. And still, Rex did not move away. He remained where he was, his gaze steady, his posture composed, as if he understood that freedom was not something he needed to act upon immediately, not when there was still something unfinished in the air. The Marine who had first spoken turned toward the handler, his voice low, almost reflective. He never doubted. He said, not as a question, not even as a statement meant to be answered, just as something that needed to be acknowledged. The handler nodded once, slowly. He does not know how, he replied, his tone carrying a quiet certainty. Because for Rex, doubt had never been part of the equation. There was only what was, what could be sensed, what could be known without the need for words. And in that simplicity, he had seen what everyone else had missed. The wind shifted again, carrying the distant sound of waves breaking softly against the shore, a reminder that the world continued, that time had not stopped, even if for a moment it had felt like it had. Rex lifted his head slightly, his gaze turning toward the horizon, not searching, not expecting, just observing, as if taking in the space that had opened around him. And then, slowly, he turned back, his eyes moving across the group, settling briefly on each face, not in recognition, but in quiet awareness, before returning once more to the empty ground where the coffin had been. And in that moment, there was no tension left, no urgency, no question, only a calm understanding that what needed to be done had been done. The Marine took a step forward, his boots pressing lightly into the earth, and then another, until he stood where the coffin had once rested, his gaze lowering, his hand lifting slightly as if to touch something that was no longer there. But he stopped short, letting it fall back to his side, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to prove, only something to carry forward. The chaplain finally spoke, his voice soft, steady, but different now, no longer delivering an ending, but acknowledging a continuation. Though his words were few, they carried a weight that settled gently over the group, not heavy, not overwhelming, just enough to mark the moment without trying to define it. Rex shifted his stance slightly, his body turning away from the space at last, his attention moving forward, toward the path that led out of the cemetery. And after a brief pause, he began to walk, not quickly, not with urgency, just a steady, quiet movement that did not ask to be followed, but invited it nonetheless. The handler fell into step beside him without hesitation, not leading, not guiding, just accompanying, and one by one, the others began to move as well, their steps slow at first, then more certain, as if finding a new rhythm to replace the one they had lost. And as they walked away from the place that had nearly become a final chapter, there was no need to speak of what had happened, no need to explain it or analyze it, because some moments are not meant to be broken down into understanding. They are meant to be carried, quietly, steadily, like a truth that does not fade. And at the center of it all, Rex walked on, not as a hero, not as something extraordinary, but simply as what he had always been, a companion who listened when others could not, and who stayed, even when the world believed there was nothing left to stay for. The path out of the cemetery curved gently along the edge of a low hill, its gravel surface pale against the darker soil, and as they walked, the sound of their boots softened, blending into the steady hush of the wind and the distant rhythm of the ocean beyond. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever words might have come would have felt too small for what they carried. Rex moved ahead by a few paces, not leading, not pulling, just walking with a quiet certainty that did not ask to be followed, his stride even, measured, as though each step had already been decided long before this moment arrived. The handler remained beside him, matching that pace without effort, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the dog, not to check, not to guide, but simply to remain connected to something he did not fully understand but no longer questioned. Behind them, the others followed in a loose line, their formation no longer shaped by ceremony or duty, but by something softer, something that did not require instruction. The Marine who had first placed his hand on the coffin kept his gaze forward, his expression thoughtful, his step steady, but there was a change in him now, a quiet shift that settled deeper than the surface, as though something inside had been rearranged without asking permission. The air carried a gentle warmth now, the kind that comes when the clouds begin to thin, allowing the light to press through in soft, uneven patches across the ground, and in those patches, the world seemed almost ordinary again, almost familiar, but not quite the same. Not after what had just unfolded. A magpie called from somewhere in the distance, its sharp, clear note cutting briefly through the quiet before fading again, and, for a moment, it felt as though the sound had marked the passing of something unseen, not an ending, not a beginning, just a turning point that could not be reversed. Rex slowed slightly as they reached the open gate, his head lifting just a fraction as he stepped beyond the boundary, pausing for the briefest second, not out of hesitation, but as if acknowledging the space behind him, the place where something had almost been lost, and then, without looking back, he continued forward. The handler followed without breaking stride, his hand brushing lightly against Rex's shoulder for a moment, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the quiet weight it carried. The Marine behind them exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooler air, his eyes lingering on the path ahead, not because he was searching for anything, but because he had begun to understand that not everything needed to be found to be believed. The road stretched out before them, leading away from the cemetery and back toward the wider world, where routines would resume and questions would begin to form. But for now, none of that mattered, not in this moment, not in this space between what had been and what would come next. Rex's ears twitched once as a light breeze shifted direction, carrying with it a new mix of scents, earth, salt, something distant and alive, and he responded not with urgency, not with alertness, but with quiet awareness, the kind that does not interrupt, but simply registers. His body remained relaxed, his pace unchanged, as if the world had settled into a rhythm that no longer required his intervention. The handler glanced down at him again, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth, not out of relief, not out of pride, but out of something deeper, something that did not need to be named, because it was already understood. Behind them, the others began to spread out slightly, their steps less aligned now, more natural, each person finding their own pace, their own way of carrying what had happened. The chaplain walked near the back, his hands folded loosely, his gaze lowered, not in contemplation of loss, but in quiet recognition of something that had defied it. The woman who had stood near the front earlier now walked with her shoulders eased, her breath steady, her eyes no longer searching, as if whatever she had needed to see had already been shown to her in a way she could not ignore. The Marine reached the edge of the road and paused for a moment, his boots stopping just short of the bitumen, his eyes lifting toward the horizon where the light had begun to break more clearly through the thinning clouds. And in that light, there was no answer, no explanation, just a simple, undeniable presence, the kind that does not argue, does not justify, only exists. He stood there for a second longer, then stepped forward, Crossing that invisible line between what had been questioned and what had been accepted, Rex continued on ahead, his form steady against the open stretch of road, no longer framed by the quiet confines of the cemetery, but moving freely within a space that felt wider, more open, more forgiving, and yet he carried nothing extra with him. No weight, no need to prove what had already been proven. He simply walked, as he always had, as he always would, and in that simple, unremarkable movement there was something that lingered, something that stayed with those who followed, not as a memory to be replayed, but as a quiet understanding that would surface again in moments of doubt, moments when the world seemed too certain in its conclusions, too quick to close what might still be open. And as the group moved further from the cemetery, the sounds of the ocean grew a little clearer, the wind a little warmer, the light a little stronger. And somewhere within that steady unfolding of the ordinary, there remained the echo of what had just happened, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent, like a truth that does not need to be spoken to be remembered. And at the center of it all, Rex walked on, not looking back, because he did not need to. He had already seen what others had not, and now, there was nothing left to search for, only a path ahead that did not require explanation, only presence. The road stretched wider as they moved further from the cemetery, the gravel giving way to worn bitumen that held the warmth of the late morning sun, and with each step the world seemed to return to its usual rhythm, distant traffic humming softly beyond the trees, the low call of seabirds circling somewhere above the coastline, the scent of salt lingering in the air like a quiet reminder that life continued, steady and indifferent. And yet for those walking that road, nothing felt quite the same. Not after what they had just witnessed, not after the moment where something had refused to end when it was meant to. Rex slowed near the edge of the road where a narrow track curved toward a line of coastal scrub, his head lifting slightly as he took in the air, not searching, not tracking, just sensing, the way he always had, but now without urgency, without the tension that had defined him only moments before. The handler stopped beside him, his boots settling into the dust with a soft, muted sound, his eyes following the dog's gaze toward the horizon where the ocean shimmered faintly through gaps in the trees. And for a moment, neither of them moved, not because they needed to, but because the stillness itself felt complete. Behind them the others gathered loosely, no longer in formation, no longer bound by ceremony. Just people standing together in the aftermath of something that did not fit into any pattern they knew. The Marine who had first spoken earlier stepped forward slightly, his eyes drifting from Rex to the handler, then out toward the same distant view, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "They will ask questions," he said, not as a warning, not as a concern, just as a fact that would come in time. The handler nodded once, slowly. "They always do," he replied, his tone calm, almost reflective, because questions were part of the world they lived in, part of the structure that tried to make sense of everything. But what had happened today did not belong entirely to that structure. It sat somewhere just beyond it, in a place that did not require answers to be real. Rex shifted his weight slightly, his ears twitching once as a new sound carried across the wind, faint but familiar, the distant echo of the ambulance now far along the coastal road, and, though it was barely audible, he acknowledged it with a small tilt of his head, not out of concern, not out of need to follow, but as if marking its presence, confirming that what had been set in motion continued beyond his reach. The handler glanced down at him again, his expression softening just a fraction, a quiet understanding settling into place, not just of what Rex had done, but of what it meant to trust something that could not be easily explained. The Marine took a breath, slow and steady, his shoulders easing as he looked out across the stretch of land before them. "I felt it," he said after a moment, his voice low, almost to himself. "Just for a second, before we opened it." The handler turned his head slightly, listening, not interrupting, not questioning, just allowing the words to settle. "I would not have believed it if he had not," the Marine continued, his sentence trailing off as he glanced toward Rex, who remained still, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned with the weight of the conversation. The handler gave a small nod. "He does not need belief," he said quietly, "only truth." And that was enough. No more explanation, no further reasoning, just a simple acknowledgement of The difference between how they saw the world and how Rex experienced it. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, rustling through the scrub and bending the taller grasses along the roadside, carrying with it the distant crash of waves against the shore, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to ground everything in something larger, something older than any one moment. Rex turned then, not back toward the cemetery, not toward the road, but forward along the narrow track that led toward the coastline. His decision quiet but clear, his body aligning with the path as if it had always been there waiting for him. The handler hesitated for only a second before following, not questioning the direction, not needing to know where it would lead, just trusting the movement itself. The others watched for a moment, then slowly began to move as well, not all of them, not at once, but enough to show that something in Rex's quiet certainty had extended beyond that single moment at the coffin. The Marine fell into step a short distance behind, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, as if the tension of the unanswered had been replaced by something simpler, something that did not demand resolution. The path narrowed slightly as it wound through the scrub, the ground uneven in places, small stones shifting underfoot, but Rex moved with ease, his steps sure, his pace unhurried, the handler matching him without effort, the sound of the ocean growing clearer. Now, each wave breaking against the shore in a steady, calming rhythm, and as they walked, there was no need to speak, no need to revisit what had happened, because it was already there, carried in the quiet space between them, not as a story to be told, but as a truth to be held. And ahead, beyond the final stretch of low brush, the coastline opened wide, the water stretching out under the soft light of the midday sky, endless and calm. And Rex stopped at the edge, his body still, his gaze fixed on the horizon, not searching, not expecting, just present, as if this was where the moment finally settled, where everything that had unfolded could rest without needing to be explained. The handler stood beside him, silent, steady, and behind them, the others slowed, giving space without needing to be asked, because some moments are not meant to be crowded, they are meant to be witnessed quietly. And in that open, windswept place, with the sound of the ocean carrying across the land, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to question, only the quiet understanding that sometimes what we believe to be the end is simply a place where something else begins, and that truth does not always arrive with noise or certainty. Sometimes it arrives on 4 steady paws, and waits until the rest of us are ready to listen. The ocean did not rush to meet them. It waited, steady and unhurried, its surface stretching out beneath a pale Australian sky that had finally begun to clear, and in that wide, open space, something inside each of them began to settle into place, not fully understood, not neatly defined, but present, undeniable. Rex stood at the edge where the land gave way to a narrow strip of sand and scattered rock, his body still, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the water met the sky in a line so thin it almost disappeared. The wind moved through his coat, lifting the darker fur along his back in soft ripples. But he did not react, he did not shift, he simply remained, as if this was where everything he had carried had finally found its rest. The handler stood beside him, one step behind, his boots pressed into the uneven ground, his posture relaxed but attentive, not watching for anything, not expecting anything, just present in the same quiet space. Behind them the others had slowed, some standing further back along the path, others stepping closer to the edge, but none intruding, none breaking the stillness that had formed around the dog. The Marine who had spoken earlier moved to stand a few meters away, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his eyes moving from the horizon back to Rex, then back again, as if trying to understand how the two could exist in the same moment, one vast and endless, the other grounded and silent, and yet both carrying something equally difficult to define. The sound of the waves rolled in steadily, each one breaking, with a soft, rhythmic pulse against the shore, not loud, not forceful, just constant, like a heartbeat that belonged to the world itself. And in that rhythm there was something familiar, something that echoed the faint, fragile pattern they had felt earlier, the one that had changed everything. Rex's ears shifted slightly, not toward the sound, but with it, as if aligning. as if acknowledging a connection that did not need to be explained. The handler glanced at him briefly, then out across the water, his breath steady, his thoughts quiet, because whatever questions had begun to form had already lost their urgency. They no longer needed answers. Not here. Not now. The Marine stepped forward a little, closing the distance by a meter or two, his boots pressing into the softer ground near the edge, and he stopped there, not wanting to intrude, but unable to stay back entirely. His voice, when it came, was low, almost carried away by the wind before it could reach anyone. "Do you think he knew the whole time?" he asked, not expecting a clear answer, not even directing it to anyone in particular, just letting the question exist in the open air. The handler did not respond immediately, his eyes still on Rex, watching the way the dog stood, the way his breathing had settled into something calm and even, the way there was no longer any trace of the tension that had driven him earlier. "He did not know in the way we think of knowing," he said after a moment, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "He just did not let go of what was still there. And that was enough." The Marine nodded once, slowly, his gaze returning to the horizon, not seeking confirmation, just accepting the possibility, because sometimes that was all that was needed. The wind shifted again, carrying a stronger scent of salt and distant seaweed, the air warmer now as the clouds continued to break apart above them, letting more light through. And in that light, the water took on a softer shade, less gray, more alive. Rex moved then, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a slow, deliberate motion, stepping forward just enough for his paws to reach the edge where the ground dipped slightly toward the sand. He lowered his head briefly, sniffing the air, then lifted it again, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed, as if confirming that everything beyond this point was as it should be. The handler watched him closely, not because he expected anything more, but because he had learned that even the smallest movement from Rex carried meaning, even when it appeared simple on the surface. Behind them, the group remained quiet, their presence respectful, their distance intentional. No one spoke, no one interrupted, because there was a shared understanding now, unspoken but clear, that this moment belonged to something larger than any one of them. The Marine took a slow breath, the sound of the ocean filling his ears, the weight in his chest easing just slightly, not gone, not replaced, but shifted, as if something that had been tightly held had finally loosened its grip. Rex stood there for another moment, then another, his body aligned with the horizon, his presence steady, and then, almost imperceptibly, he exhaled, a slow, quiet release that carried no tension, no urgency, just a calm acceptance. And with that breath, something in the air seemed to settle as well, the last trace of what had driven him earlier dissolving into the steady rhythm of the world around them. The handler placed his hand lightly on Rex's back, not to guide, not to direct, just to acknowledge, and for a moment, the two stood like that, connected not by command, not by expectation, but by something far simpler, something that did not need to be named to be understood. The Marine turned slightly, his gaze moving from the horizon back toward the path they had come from, the cemetery no longer visible, hidden behind the rise of land and trees, and in that absence, there was no sense of loss, no lingering shadow, only a quiet awareness that what had nearly been left behind had instead been carried forward. And as the waves continued their steady rhythm and the wind moved softly across the open ground, the moment held, not as something extraordinary, not as something to be explained, but as something that simply was, complete in its own quiet way. And at the center of it all, Rex remained, calm, present, no longer searching, because there was nothing left to find, only something to keep, something that did not fade with distance or time, something that had already proven itself in the only way that mattered. Time did not stop at the shoreline. It moved forward the way it always does, quiet and steady, carrying with it the weight of what had happened and placing it gently into memory. And as the sun climbed higher above the coast, the light grew warmer, more defined, stretching across the water in long, shimmering lines that seemed to reach toward them without ever quite touching. Rex remained at the edge for a while longer, his stillness no longer charged with purpose but softened into something calmer, something settled, his breathing even, his posture relaxed, as if the part of him that had been holding on had finally let go. not because it had to, but because it could. The handler shifted his stance slightly, his boots pressing deeper into the sand, his gaze moving from the horizon back to Rex, watching him not as a tool, not as a partner in duty, but as something closer, something that existed beyond the roles they had both been trained to carry. Behind them, the others began to move again, slowly at first, their steps tentative as though they were leaving something behind that did not want to be left. But as they turned back toward the path, the rhythm returned, quiet and natural, the kind that does not need to be forced. The Marine lingered for a moment longer than the rest, his eyes tracing the line where the water met the sky, his expression thoughtful, but not troubled, not burdened, just aware of something that had shifted inside him in a way that would not easily be undone. He took a slow breath, filling his lungs with the salt air, then let it out, steady, and with that exhale, he turned as well, stepping back onto the narrow track that led away from the open shore. The handler gave Rex a light tap along his side, not a command, just a signal, and Rex responded without hesitation, turning with him, his body aligning with the new direction as easily as it had aligned with the old. No resistance, no pause, just movement, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to question. The path wound back through the low scrub, the sound of the ocean fading gradually behind them, replaced once more by the softer noises of land, wind brushing through leaves, the distant call of birds, the faint hum of a road not far beyond the trees. And with each step, the world seemed to fold back into its usual shape, familiar, predictable, but not unchanged, not for them. The handler walked in silence, his thoughts not racing, not searching, just present, turning over the moment in his mind not to understand it, but to hold it, the way one holds something fragile, knowing that trying to define it too clearly might cause it to slip away. Rex walked beside him, his gait steady, his ears relaxed, occasionally twitching at a sound or scent that passed through the air, but never lingering, never shifting into the focused intensity that had defined him earlier. That part of him had quieted, not disappeared, just settled, waiting perhaps for another moment when it might be needed again. Behind them the others followed, their spacing uneven now, their formation broken in the most natural way, each person moving at their own pace, carrying their own version of what had happened, some glancing at Rex from time to time, not with curiosity anymore, but with something closer to respect, as if they had witnessed something that did not belong to explanation, only acknowledgement. The Marine stepped closer to the handler after a while, closing the small gap between them, his voice low, not wanting to disturb the quiet that had formed around them. "They will write reports," he said, his tone neutral, almost detached. "They will try to explain it." The handler nodded slightly, his eyes still forward. "They will try," he replied, and there was no resistance in his voice, no dismissal, just a simple acceptance of how the world worked, how it needed to make sense of things, even when those things did not fit easily into the structures built to contain them. Rex continued walking, unaware of the conversation, or perhaps simply unaffected by it, his focus on the path ahead, his presence grounded in the moment rather than the meaning others might assign to it. The Marine gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if that answer was enough, not because it explained anything, but because it did not try to. And sometimes that was all that was needed. The path widened slightly as they neared the road, the ground flattening out, the trees thinning just enough to let more light through, and in that light, everything seemed clearer, not in the sense of understanding, but in the sense of acceptance, the kind that does not require resolution. The handler glanced down at Rex again, his hand brushing briefly along the dog's back, a quiet gesture, almost absent, but filled with something deeper than habit. Rex responded with a small shift of his tail, not a wag, not excitement, just acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the connection between them. And as they stepped back onto the road, the world opened up once more, the stretch of bitumen leading away in both directions, the sky above wider, brighter, the horizon no longer framed by trees but by distance itself. The group slowed again, not because they needed to stop, but because the moment invited it, a natural pause between what had been and what would come next. The Marine looked down the road, then back toward the path they had come from, the cemetery hidden once again from view. And in that absence, there was no lingering weight, no sense of something unfinished. Only the quiet knowledge that what needed to happen had happened, and that was enough. Rex stood calmly beside the handler, his body relaxed, his gaze forward, no longer searching, no longer listening for something beneath the surface, just present, fully, completely, as if he had always been this way. And perhaps he had. Perhaps it was the rest of them who had only just begun to see it. And as the wind moved gently across the open road and the day continued to unfold around them, there was nothing left to add, nothing left to prove, only the quiet, steady presence of something that had already spoken in the only way that mattered. The pause on the roadside did not last long, but it did not need to, because something within each of them had already settled into place, quiet and steady, like a stone, dropped into still water that no longer disturbed the surface but remained beneath it, shaping everything around it in ways unseen. The Marine shifted his stance slightly, his boots scraping softly against the bitumen as he turned his gaze down the road where the ambulance had disappeared earlier, though it was long gone now, its presence replaced by the ordinary flow of the day, distant vehicles passing far beyond the bend, unseen but faintly heard, the kind of background movement that marks the world continuing as it always does. And yet for him, and for the others standing there, that continuation felt different, not because the world had changed, but because they had. Rex stood beside the handler, his posture calm, his breathing even, his eyes steady, not fixed on anything in particular, but aware of everything in a way that did not demand attention. The handler let his hand rest lightly against the dog's neck for a moment, fingers pressing gently into the thick fur, not as a command, not as reassurance, but as something closer to gratitude, though he did not say it aloud. Because some acknowledgments do not need words. They exist fully in the space between two beings who understand each other without explanation. The Marine stepped closer, his voice low, thoughtful. "What do you think happens next?" he asked, not out of uncertainty, but out of quiet curiosity. The kind that comes when something does not end the way it was expected to. The handler glanced toward him, then back to Rex, considering the question not as something that required an answer, but as something that simply existed. "He keeps going," he said after a moment, his tone simple, grounded, "and so do we." And that was enough, not because it answered everything, but because it did not try to. Rex shifted slightly at the sound of their voices, his ears flicking once before settling again, his attention moving briefly between them, then returning forward, as if acknowledging their presence. Without needing to engage, the wind moved across the open stretch of road, warmer now, carrying with it the scent of sunlit earth and distant sea. And in that air there was a sense of movement, not urgent, not pressing, but steady, the kind that invites rather than demands. The group began to disperse slowly, not with any clear signal, not with any spoken direction, but naturally, as though each person had reached the same quiet understanding at the same time, that it was time to move on, not away from what had happened, but forward with it. The Marine took a step, then another, his path leading along the road in the opposite direction from where the ambulance had gone, his pace measured, his posture relaxed, and after a few seconds, others followed, each choosing their own direction, their own rhythm, their own way of carrying the moment. The chaplain offered a small nod as he passed, not speaking, just acknowledging. The woman who had stood near the front earlier gave a brief, soft glance toward Rex before turning away, her expression calm now, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, just settled. The handler remained still for a moment longer, his eyes following the others as they moved away, then returning to Rex, who stood as he had been, steady, present, unaffected by the departure, as if the movement of people around him was simply part of the larger rhythm he existed within, not something that required response. The handler took a breath, slow and even, then gave a small motion with his hand, not a command, not a signal of urgency, just a quiet invitation. Rex responded immediately, stepping forward with the same calm certainty that had guided him earlier, his path aligning with the road ahead, neither hurried nor hesitant, just steady. The handler fell into step beside him, their movement synchronized without effort, not because they had practiced it, but because it had become natural, something that existed beyond instruction. The road stretched out before them, bordered by low grass and scattered trees, the light now stronger, casting longer shadows that moved with them as they walked. And in that movement, there was no sense of leaving something behind, no sense of loss or separation, only the continuation of something that had already begun long before this day, something that had revealed itself in a single moment and then settled back into quiet presence. Rex's ears flicked again as a distant sound reached him, a bird calling from somewhere unseen, and he acknowledged it with a small tilt of his head before continuing on, unbothered, unchanged, his attention not fixed on any one thing, but open to everything. The handler glanced at him briefly, then forward again, his thoughts quiet, not trying to revisit what had happened, not trying to explain it, just holding it in the same way Rex held the world, without question, without resistance. The wind shifted once more, brushing lightly against them, and in that movement there was something almost like a closing, not of the story, not of the moment, but of the tension that had surrounded it, leaving behind only the calm, steady rhythm of the present. The Marine, now further down the road, paused briefly and looked back, not at the cemetery, not at the place where everything had changed, but at Rex, standing beside the handler, walking forward without hesitation, and for a second, something in his expression softened, not into a smile, not into relief, but into understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real. He turned again and continued on, his steps steady, his path clear, and behind him, Rex walked on as well, not as something extraordinary, not as something to be remembered in grand terms, but as what he had always been, a quiet presence that listened when others did not, that stayed when others moved on, and that carried truth not in words, but in the simple, unwavering act of being there when it mattered most. The road stretched on beneath a sky that had fully opened now, the clouds drifting apart into soft, scattered shapes that no longer held the weight of the morning, and with each step forward, the world seemed to settle into a quiet balance, not untouched by what had happened, but shaped by it in a way that did not need to be spoken aloud. Rex walked beside the handler with the same steady rhythm he had always carried, his presence no longer marked by urgency or tension, but by a calm that felt earned, as though something within him had completed its purpose and returned to rest, his ears flicking occasionally at the passing sounds of the day, a distant engine, the rustle of leaves, the faint cry of a bird overhead, but none of it held him for long, his attention moving fluidly, naturally, without the need to hold on to anything. The handler walked in silence, his gaze forward, his thoughts quiet, not because there was nothing to think about, but because everything that needed to be understood had already found its place, not in logic, not in explanation, but in something deeper, something that did not need to be broken apart to be real. The warmth of the sun settled gently across his shoulders, the light stretching along the road ahead, and for a moment, it felt as though the day itself had softened, as though the world had taken a breath and decided to move forward with a quieter kind of certainty. Behind them, the path they had taken no longer held any pull, the cemetery hidden beyond the rise of land and trees. Its stillness left where it belonged, not as something abandoned, but as something completed. And ahead, the road carried on, unmarked, unburdened, waiting only for the steps that would follow it. Rex slowed slightly as they reached a bend where the road curved gently toward a line of low houses set back from the coast, their roofs catching the light in uneven patches, smoke rising faintly from one chimney, the quiet signs of life continuing without interruption. He paused there for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but as if acknowledging the shift from one space into another, from the quiet edge of reflection into the rhythm of ordinary life. And then, without looking back, he stepped forward again, his movement smooth, certain, the handler following without pause, their pace unchanged, their direction clear. A Uda passed them at a distance, its sound low and steady, the driver lifting a hand in a casual gesture as he went by, unaware of the moment that had unfolded not far behind, unaware of the quiet line that had been crossed between what was expected and what had proven itself otherwise. And that was how it would be. The world would continue, questions would be asked, reports would be written, explanations would be attempted, but none of that would touch what had truly happened, not in the way that mattered, because what had taken place did not belong to systems or words, It belonged to something simpler, something that did not need to be recorded to be real. Rex's tail moved once, a slow, relaxed motion, not in response to anything specific, just a natural part of his steady gait. And in that small movement, there was something grounding, something that reminded the handler that this quiet walking, this simple presence, was where the truth of it all lived, not in the moment of discovery, not in the sudden shift from loss to life, but in the way it carried forward without needing to be held up or examined. The Marine, now further along the road in a different direction, did not look back again, but the moment stayed with him, not as something to analyze, but as something that had quietly reshaped the way he would see the world from that day on, and that was enough. The wind moved softly across the open land, carrying with it the scent of the sea, the warmth of the sun, and something else, something that could not be named but could be felt, a quiet echo of what had passed, not fading, not lingering, just existing, as steady as the rhythm of the waves, as constant as the movement of the day. Rex walked on, his path simple, his purpose no longer something to be questioned, because it had already been fulfilled in the only way that mattered, not with noise, not with force, but with a quiet refusal to turn away from what